It is my pleasure to introduce Sue Buto to us. I'll let her give her short bio, but Sue has graciously joined us today to educate us about 3D-HP and what the USGS is doing in developing that program. So Sue, thank you so much for taking the time. You should be able to share your screen.
Excellent, thank you. And I really appreciate the invitation to speak to you guys. I'm a lifelong Westerner, so I'm totally into the Western states stuff, and don't want to show my bias as a national person, but I do appreciate the time. And I'm a geographer with the National Geospatial Program in the U.S. Geological Survey. And I am the Hydrography Data Acquisition Lead, which is a new role for hydrography. And I'll go through some of the details of that as we get through. But let's launch in. And hang on, there we go. So the 3D Hydrography Program is part of a larger initiative or plan going forward for the National Geospatial Program that we're calling the 3D National Topography Model. The idea behind the model is integrating our elevation and hydrography to model the nation's topography in 3D. And if you think back in the day with our classic 24K topographic maps, the elevation and the hydrography were mapped together at the time, and everything was integrated. And we spent some time in the digital age kind of ripping data off of those maps to create hydrography on one side and elevation on the other side. And those data sets became separated from each other. So now we have an opportunity to bring them back together because we're working towards our baseline goal for elevation data for the 3DEP program, which is one of the ongoing initiatives towards building the 3D National Topography Model. And for those who are not aware, the 3D elevation program reached 89.5% available or in progress at the end of federal fiscal year 22. And we are on track to complete acquisition in just a few years, FY26, which is really great news. So then the next phase of building this 3D National Topography Model is kind of the phase that we're really in now, which is defining our next generation programs. And those programs are the 3D Hydrography Program that I'll give you some details on today, and the next generation of 3DEP. So I know a lot of folks would say, because of the program design of the original 3DEP program, it was designed originally to be an 8-year program, and everybody thought, oh, what happens at year 8? Does everything stop? And no, that's not the case. We're developing a new program for 3DEP and thinking about, modernizing into new quality levels. A lot of folks want QL1 data, and also thinking about refresh cycles for areas that, for instance, experience a lot of landscape change. So our elevation team is busily at work on that, so you guys should be hearing more about that in the coming year. And this is all, again, to serve this idea of an integrated 3D model that allows us to sort of have a single system that models the nation's topography. So I think many of you are probably familiar with our national hydrography data sets as they sit today. And those are the National Hydrography Data Set, the NHD, Watershed Boundary Data Set, WBD, and the NHD Plus High Resolution, which is a product that's derived from elevation and the NHD and the WBD. And they are venerable data sets. They've been around for a long time, sort of almost from the advent of the digital age. And they're well used, and they are nationally complete. The NHD has some, 9.5 or so million miles of stream network, and the WBD has, 8 nested levels of hydrologic units for indexing information. The NHD and the WBD were built on a model that involved leveraging local knowledge and direct editing of the data through our stewardship program. And we've had over the years participants from 41 states and Washington, D.C. Actively working to edit or update the data set. It's a really great idea conceptually, and it's wonderful to be able to leverage local knowledge in the data set, but updates to the data set are not uniform. So where states or entities have resources, they can edit the data and they can improve the data. Where there are no resources, those data sometimes are as much as 40 years old. They were stripped from the original topo maps, and that's what they are. So the NHD has become more inconsistent nationally over time. And that's an issue in the data set. It's kind of an issue in equity across the country for the data set. But the biggest issue with the NHD as we approach completion of 3D elevation program data for the nation is that those NHD surface water features, with a few notable exceptions, do not align well with the accurate 3D elevation program data. And so as we reach completion, that becomes sort of more of a problem. And so hydrography that is derived from that elevation offers a solution to us for some of those inconsistency problems and the lack of alignment with the elevation and hydrography. And so we have developed as a program a goal to acquire new hydrography data that is standardized and aligns vertically and horizontally with the 3DEP data. And there's other improvements to the data that I'll discuss as we go. But the idea is to support more accurate modeling and analysis capabilities that are even more available and easy to use out of the box than even 3D, that even NHD was. And the key to this is that we don't want to throw away the decades of knowledge that have been gained through the NHD and the WBD, and the decades of work that our stewards had done, or the knowledge that our stewards have about their local hydrography. So we want to kind of keep the good stuff and improve the bad. So we're not designing this program sort of out of the blue. We did a study in 2016 called the Hydrography Requirements and Benefits Study, because the complexity of hydrography and it took us a little bit of time to get to a program design based on the HRBS. But the HRBS did document over 400 mission critical business uses for hydrography data, national hydrography data. And we asked questions and took information from all 50 states, 23 federal agencies, 8 tribal governments, and national associations as well. So we surveyed a broad swath of hydrography users. And we found that our national hydrography data are really essential to a broad range of applications. And the program as it is designed in the NHD WBD is providing about $538 million of annual benefits. And by benefits, we generally mean the benefits that the users get by not having to create their own data and everybody duplicating effort across the board. But the other thing that the HRBS found is that we could, with a modernized 3D enabled hydrography program, we could provide over $1 billion annually in benefits to our users if we met all the user requirements, which is not always easy to do. And some of those user requirements that came out of the HRBS, I think there's a couple of the key ones are the level of detail that users needed. 100% of the respondents indicated that it was their mission critical activities require detail. They require data also to be positionally accurate, so that the streams that they're working with are accurately located in the digital data set that's a representation of their stream. That's very key. And then also the integration of elevation and hydrography is key. And all this information was put into a program design that ultimately landed us on derivation of hydrography from 1 meter DEMs based on 3-depth elevation data in CONUS and the islands and territories, 5 meter DEMs in Alaska, where the baseline 3-depth data is from 𝐸FSAR data. We looked at a scenario where we would derive hydrography from 1/2 meter DEMs. But generally, 1/2 meter DEMs require QL1 data nationally across the US, and 3-depth was designed as a QL2 program. So we have a mix of QLs. It's all QL2 or better, but we don't have consistent QL1. So that may be a future improvement that we look at, maybe if 3-depth goes for nationally consistent QL1 data at some point. So I mentioned our goals. We have sort of that general goal to align our hydrography mapping with our 3-depth data. But our other goals are to replace our older inconsistent data and to sort of model the program after 3-depth best practices around governance, around data acquisition. And I'll give a little bit more detail about that later in the presentation, but also to develop a sort of new system for hydrography that is really built for hydrologic applications, but that it also is useful for cartographic applications, because we know that our users use the data not only for analysis, but also for cartography. And frankly, we do too. Our current USGS topographic maps use our hydrography data as the stream layer. So it's important to us that we support both analysis and cartography. And we also want to work towards better integration with sort of our sister data sets. The Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for the National Wetlands Inventory, and we want them to be responsible for what they're responsible for us, and we integrate our data with their data so that we're not duplicating effort, and we're working closely with Fish and Wildlife on that. And we also kind of have a challenge in how do we handle engineered hydrography, meaning how do we manage mapping in urban systems, and making sure that canals and ditches are also properly represented in the data set. So urban systems are going to be a coming challenge for us, but we know we need to flow water through an urban system in the way it actually flows, not pretending that it doesn't exist. And then there's also a long-term goal for interoperability with additional data going forward. So step back and look at some of the reasons why we want to update the NHD, and then discuss sort of where we're headed with the data model. So the NHD today is very complex. It was derived originally from the topographic maps. As I mentioned earlier, we kind of stripped off anything that was watery from the NHD or from the topographic maps, and that information found its way into the NHD. And then over time, to support the various requirements from different states and entities, we started to add more and more complexity. So for instance, in reservoirs, there are 24 varieties of reservoir in the NHD, all identified by an F type and an F code. So we've got a bunch of codes and types in there. And these include things like having swimming pools mapped in some areas, which arguably is maybe not appropriate for a national level data set. And then there's other things that were on the topographic maps that have found their way into the NHD, things like rapids that were identified on the topographic maps, or rocks, for instance, particularly in ocean navigation. So there's some interesting features in the NHD. And these features, they're useful for some, but they are a major burden for maintenance, having sort of all these types of codes and keeping those in good condition is a definite burden. And they also tend to be a burden, or the complexity of the data model tends to be a burden for use. Folks who really know the NHD know how to use it, but it can be a little bit daunting when you first open up the database and understand or try to understand what's happening with the data set. And this is kind of an example of the complexity. So there's 3 data sets that we're managing at the moment. Again, the NHD, the WBD, and the NHD Plus. And these are examples of the data model posters that go with those data sets. And you can see particularly with the NHD up in the corner here, it is an extremely complex data model and can be kind of difficult to navigate. Although I will say that our data management folks and data delivery folks do a darn good job making it a little easier to deal with. The other thing that has become difficult for USGS to manage, quite frankly, are the tools that we have kept up so that our users can, or our stewards can, directly edit the data by checking it out of the geodatabase and editing and then checking it back in. So there's no less than a dozen tools, I think, for maintaining the NHD and the WBD. And that's quite a burden. They're all Esri-based tools as well, so we have to keep up with varieties of Esri revs and change the rev, for instance, redeveloping the tools for ArcGIS Pro. It's a lot of effort sort of internal to USGS. So speaking of goals, we've set some technical goals to develop a pretty radically simplified data set and to merge everything into a single conceptual data set where catchments, drainage areas for stream reaches are integral to the system, and that those catchments can be gathered up to build hydrologic units like we have in the WBD, so everything works seamlessly together. And also to simplify workflows to create and get the data sets out to our users. And so looking at that simplified data model, we have some technical folks who are working on that. And there was a hydro community called the Drew Decker manages for us just recently, where Dave Blodgett spoke about the data model. And I believe he's speaking at the NRWG 3HP forum tomorrow. We can get you contacted with that, or the recording of his hydrography community call if you're interested. So I'm going to skim over the details of the data model, basically to say that the model, as I mentioned, will be radically simplified, and we're basing the model on international standards. And that's something that's been directed to us by the Geospatial Data Act of 2018. To use international standards where feasible for our data. And so we're basing the data model on the OGC surface hydrology features, or high features conceptual model. And this will give us a common vocabulary and terminology that we can base the data model on. And it's all published in the OGC conceptual model. And it also promotes interoperability. We work fairly closely with NOAA, who is working on the National Water Model, and they are moving towards an OGC system, as well as our partners in Canada are moving towards a similar system. So we'll have interoperability across the Canadian border as well. And again, the data model will support a multi-scale hydrologic unit product similar to WBD. So we know WBD is very important to a lot of our users. And one other key here, I'll mention on occasion that we have the ability to link information, or will have the ability to link information to the hydrologic network. We tend to term that as addressing data, just like a street address. And that's kind of key to the data set. So that information that you want on the data model, we don't have to necessarily carry that, like swimming pools or a particular type of reservoir. But you'll have the ability to link information, additional information to the network that you can carry, or there will be systems through the Internet of Water that I'll talk about in a second, that you can share that information more widely so that everybody isn't duplicating linking of data to the network. So our current plans we're working on in this federal fiscal year is to populate 3DHP data. We're starting with migrating the 24K NHD into this new simplified schema to provide sort of a best available network of data. There will be some pieces of the NHD that don't come along for the ride, and there'll be somewhat limited functionality in terms of the way 3DHP is ultimately designed to work, which includes having Z values or elevation values on the vertices of the features. And then we are actively working on data acquisition plans and strategies, and we will add elevation-derived hydrography projects to the data set and replace the older NHD with the newer data. The elevation-derived hydrography will be collected and validated against the elevation-derived hydrography specifications that we published in 2020. And so the validation is a really key part, that we bring the data in and we validate it against the specifications so that we know that it's good data. And then that becomes sort of the primary path for improving data, rather than sort of incremental piece-by-piece edits that happen in a distributed manner. And to that end, we foresee with the 3DHP that we'll have much less geometric editing needed on the data and more attribution validation. Is this stream named correctly? And if it's not located correctly, tell us about that, and we'll work to address that issue. So user corrections to both the geometry and the attribution, rather than through a set of tools and distributed editing, will be entered through a web markup application, very similar to the markup application that we had for NHD and WBD. And that reduces not only tool maintenance on the USGS side, but it also reduces the expertise, the software expertise that users need to submit an edit. You don't need to have the Esri suite of software in order to change the data or suggest a change to the data. The intent is that the edits will be queued and managed directly by USGS, but we do want to retain our network of state stewards and local users to review that information and review those suggestions, because state and local folks absolutely know their hydrography better than we ever can. So we need that expertise for you to say, oh yes, that actually is an error, and it needs to be fixed. So those markup tools are slated for development and release in late fiscal year 24. I mentioned earlier the Internet of Water. 3DHP is designed to support the Internet of Water. And the idea around the Internet of Water is that there's a lot of information, water-related data that's collected across the US in multiple agencies and entities. So water quality samples, flow information. But a lot of those data sort of stay siloed in each agency's information systems. And the Internet of Water is a proposal or a process by which we're developing a geospatial information infrastructure that will allow the federated sharing and discovery of water information. So if information is linked to the stream network and shared out widely, people can find that data and use that data in their applications without having to duplicate that data. So the idea behind 3DHP is that it becomes the geospatial underpinning of the Internet of Water, and will include tools that allow you to reference your information to the stream network, and then the data can be exposed to search and discovery if you choose to do so. A note about data distribution. The idea at the moment is that data distribution will be focused primarily on services, but we will have data downloads available. The primary access would be through web services, and some of that is to support activities like the Internet of Water, and to have people accessing the same data as they're addressing information to it. And so we limit multiple versions of the data set. That said, we know that people who go out in the field or live in remote places or just need a static version of the data set to reference in scientific papers, for instance, need the ability to download. So we will have downloadable data. And the idea is that there will be, at a minimum, an annual static release that has a digital object identifier associated with it. So you can say, this is the data set that I used for this analysis, or this is the data set that my agency, for instance, has decided to standardize on, at least for the time being. Much easier to reference than the current NHD, which does not have DOIs. So when you download it, it is what it is. Hopefully you take a date, and that's all you can do to understand what the vintage or what the exact data set was that you're using. So I mentioned earlier that we are modeling 3D-HP in many ways after the 3D elevation program, and that includes with data acquisition. And this is a very new thing for our hydrography community, again, because we have tended to go towards direct editing on a state-by-state basis with the data. But in order to refresh our data nationally, we need to sort of build a community to do that. And it's sort of two sides of data acquisition that work in concert together to build towards this goal of completing new hydrography mapping for the nation. On one side is our 3D-HP working group, which is a federal group where the federal agencies that have interest in mission critical activities around hydrography, they can identify their mapping priorities, they can enter into interagency agreements with USGS, and then can be used to either do direct data acquisition or as matching funds for state proposed projects in BAA. And the BAA is the other side of this. And go to the next slide to go into a little more detail. Some of you are probably familiar with the 3DEP BAA. I know some of you have definitely applied for, or put in proposals for the BAA, and we really appreciate those partnerships. So 3D-HP will issue a BAA probably in concert with the 3DEP BAA, hopefully in FY24. And for those of you not familiar, broad agency announcement is our fair and equitable mechanism for non-federal entities to partner with the USGS and other federal agencies to acquire data. It is a system where proposals are submitted to the USGS, and those proposals are evaluated by a team of technical experts against a set of criteria to make sure that everybody's on a level playing field when it comes to evaluating proposals, and those that get selected were selected again in a fair and equitable manner. The BAA can be applied for by federal agencies, by state and local governments, by tribal entities, academic institution, even private partners. And so that is one of the ways that we will build communities around data acquisition for the 3D-HP and build sort of this federal, state, local, federal, non-federal partnership around data acquisition. So again, on this slide, sort of those two sides of data acquisition. The BAA for 3D-HP, as I mentioned, is coming soon. At the moment, we're targeting FY24 And we'll get you guys details as soon as we have more details on how the BAA will work, but it will be very similar to the way the 3-DEP BAA works for those of you familiar. So I just want to come back, I think this is my last slide, to the concept of the 3D National Topography Model, and kind of pin back this overarching goal that's not just about hydrography, it's about integrated hydrography and elevation data, as well as over time a goal to collect inland bathymetry data, so we can have a continuous elevation surface and hydrography data that is aligned to that elevation surface. And we really believe that this vision for this 3D National Topography Model will not only provide foundational data to critical initiatives that already exist, but will likely enable new and emerging applications as the data come together. Again, if nothing else, because by virtue of being aligned with each other, there's a lot less work that has to be done in order to do hydrologic modeling with a system like this. So we're really excited to move towards this direction. And thank you guys very much. My show got a little bit, or my contact information got a little bit cut off in the slide. You can see my contact information at the top, and Steve 𝐀𝐫𝐢𝐳𝐸 is our program and planning and management lead, who manages a lot of the direction of the program, and Sylvia Terziati is our hydrography science and applications lead. So thank you very much. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to take them.
Wow. Thank you, Sue. That was a lot of information. Holy cow. And well done. We really appreciate you taking the time for us and sharing all of that. Does anybody have any questions for Sue? Don't see anything in the chat just yet.
Hi, Sue. This is Ben Hickson. Not necessarily, well, some questions. Great to see that there's a kind of a move away from the software dependency for the Esri plugins and whatnot. I like the effort towards the OGC compliance. That's great. I know that the production of the 1 meter DEMs from the 3-DEP data is a little bit behind the actual acquisition, which, I mean, it's not necessarily related to hydrography, but you had mentioned that dependency. So I was curious how that might, the production of those data sets might be accelerated by this.
Well, I'm not sure how we'll accelerate that production. I know it's a high priority to get the 3-DEP data sort of out the door as quickly as possible. One thing I will note is that we are working towards or looking at, and hopefully we'll be able to do this, developing a 1 meter seamless data set for the nation, as opposed to, you're clearly familiar with 3-DEP data, project by project 1 meter data. And having that 1 meter seamless will allow the 3D hydrography program to have a consistent base layer. So long way around to saying we're working on trying to speed up the production of those data sets, and hopefully we can get through some of the backlog that we have. Ben, thanks, and let us know if there's a particular data set you're looking for, and we'll at least let you know where it is in the queue.
All right, no worries about that, but thank you. It's great.
Yeah.
Sue, we do have one question in the chat. Will the historical data set formats be updated to match or better match the new version at any point?
Chris, could you elaborate what you mean by the historical data set formats?
Chris, you might be muted. You're welcome to come off mute.
So you were talking about the how the older data sets differed from those originally garnered from the topographic maps. Just curious that as there's updates to topography in any way, that'll be in the new maps, but for keeping track of what changes have been made if the older data will come to match it for comparison?
Oh, yeah, I don't think we'll necessarily match the older data. We will have a static version of the NHD available for a long period. I don't know exactly how long, but probably for a really long time, for comparison if that's necessary. And we will, as I mentioned, we are planning to put the entire 24K NHD into the 3DHP data model for our first go around. So there will be sort of the NHD in this cleaner data model. So if you snapshot that first data set, or if you look at the static release of that data set, you can see where those changes have been made.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Are there any other questions for Sue?
Susan, is that model available for download off of the website?
The data model?
Yeah, the data model.
We don't have a 3DH, well, we do internally have the beginnings of a 3DHP data model. So it's not available yet from the NHD website or the hydrography website, but will be hopefully soon. We'll have a first version of it. We can send you a link to the OGC high features model as well, so you can get a feel for it. It's fairly complex and there's the information, but it's kind of an interesting thing to look at the conceptualization of the model. So we'd be happy to send that to you too.
Yeah. No, that would be great, because those models always help, and that one looked piled full of data. So.
Yeah, well, and the current NHD model is available, and it is piled full of data. There's a lot of stuff in that data model. It's kind of amusing to see how much stuff ended up in the NHD.
Hey, Sue, this is Drew. Thank you very much for joining us today, and great presentation. Just want to mention real quick the LiDAR data. Yeah, we have a ways to go. We'll have, more data coming available pretty soon here, and more getting underway as well. Plus, just due to the size of the state, there's an awful lot of data already out there, including in the 1 meter seamless or 1 meter format that Sue mentioned too. So there's plenty of different, environments across the state for looking at extracting data from and beginning the process of working in this new realm. So look forward to it. Thanks.
Thanks, Drew.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, it was a fantastic presentation, and I'm sure that folks are processing. It was full of a lot of information. I'll happily distribute your slides after the meeting, so you and I can coordinate on getting those, because I'm sure folks want to dig in a little bit. I think that would help.
Absolutely. I will send them to you as soon as I can convert them to a PDF.
Perfect.
And anytime you want a presentation, of course, you have Drew, which is, all you really need. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ask questions. I just dropped both the OGC high features model link and also the current status of 3DEP, and the holes in Arizona are filling up. That's so great to see. It's very exciting.
It is exciting.
Yeah.
Keith, you raised your hand. Go ahead.
Hey, Jenna. Hey, Sue. As you may remember, Sue, I had a big part in digitizing and creating that watershed boundary data set. I'm curious as to, you referenced the challenges to the urban areas and the ditches and canals. Do you guys have a plan for that? Because I do know when I did that, it was a major undertaking to get with each city and try to acquire their data. Organizations like CAP to know, where that water flows. Do you have a plan for that as of yet?
Loose, Keith, I will say. And first of all, thank you so much for all the efforts that you put in but not only hydrography, but elevation data. We do have kind of loose plans. The urban areas will become, they'll start to solidify in the coming years as we stand up the data model. But it will be, particularly in large urban areas, as you mentioned, it will involve reaching out to cities and municipalities to understand, what parts of sewer systems or wastewater systems need to go into the data set so that we can at least have a skeleton framework to flow water through the system in an appropriate way. We can't fit an entire city's underground infrastructure into the data set. It's just not feasible. But if you go to the NHD, to Washington, D.C., we did do a project with DC where the municipal system is in the NHD in a much simplified form. And that's kind of interesting to see that system. And it's very complex, and we have a lot of work to do, as you note, to get to that place where we have those data in the right sized data for an urban system. So if you have any good ideas, let us know, Keith, since you've been down that road.
Will do. Thanks, Sue. Appreciate it.
All right. Any last questions before we let Sue go? Excellent. Well, thank you again, Sue. It's been fantastic to have you. I really appreciate your time.
And thank you, Jenna. And again, anytime, you've got Drew as a resource, or you can reach out to me anytime. Thank you, guys.
Perfect.
Bye.